Last Saturday, I went on what I thought was a normal blind date. Within 5 minutes, I realized I was sitting across from my ex-boyfriend's younger brother, who had apparently spent 2 years infiltrating my friend group and orchestrating this entire setup to get revenge on me for something that happened when his brother and I broke up. The worst part? My friends had no idea they were being manipulated the whole time. I'm 26F, and this whole mess started 3 years ago when I dated this guy Marcus for about 8 months. The relationship was pretty toxic from the start, but I was young and stupid and thought I could fix him. Marcus had serious anger issues, drinking problems, and a tendency to blame everyone else for his problems. The breakup was messy, really messy. Marcus had been lying to me about having a job for months while I was paying for everything. When I finally found out he'd been fired 6 months earlier and had been pretending to go to work every day, I broke up with him immediately. But it gets worse. After we broke up, I found out Marcus had been using my credit card to buy stuff online without telling me. We're talking about $2,000 worth of charges over several months. When I confronted him about it, he claimed it was just borrowing and that he'd planned to tell me eventually. I reported the charges as fraud and got my money back. Marcus got arrested for credit card theft and ended up with a criminal record because of it. His family was furious with me, saying I should have handled it privately instead of involving the police. Marcus has a younger brother named David, who was 19 at the time. David always worshipped his older brother and absolutely hated me for ruining Marcus's life by pressing charges. He sent me angry messages saying I was a terrible person and that I destroyed his brother's future over money. I blocked David on everything and figured that was the end of it. Marcus moved back in with his parents, and I never saw any of them again. Fast forward to about a year and a half ago. I had moved to a new neighborhood and was trying to make friends. I joined this recreational volleyball league where I met Sarah and Emma, 2 girls around my age who seemed really cool. We hit it off immediately and started hanging out regularly. They invited me to parties, we'd go out for drinks, normal friend stuff. About 6 months after we became friends, they introduced me to this guy David, who they said was Sarah's friend from college. David was cute, funny, seemed really nice. He'd show up to group hangouts occasionally, and we'd chat, but nothing romantic. Just friendly conversation. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person, and would ask thoughtful questions about my life, my job, my family. Looking back now, those questions were way too specific and personal for casual friend conversations. About 6 months ago, Sarah and Emma started suggesting that David and I would be perfect together. They'd make little comments about how we had so much in common and how cute we'd be as a couple. I wasn't really interested in dating anyone at the time, so I'd brush off their suggestions. But they kept pushing it. Every time we'd all hang out, they'd find ways to pair us up or get us talking alone. David never seemed pushy about it though. He was always respectful and never made me feel pressured. 2 months ago, Sarah and Emma really ramped up their matchmaking efforts. They started talking about how David had been asking about me and how he was too shy to ask me out directly. They said he was such a good guy and that I should give him a chance. I finally agreed to let them set us up on a blind date, mostly because I trusted their judgment and figured it couldn't hurt to meet someone new. The date was set for last Saturday night at this nice restaurant downtown. Sarah gave me David's phone number so we could coordinate meeting up, and we texted a few times that week to plan the details. His texting style seemed a little familiar, but I figured that was just because we'd chatted at group events before. Saturday night, I showed up at the restaurant and immediately saw David sitting at a table near the window. But as I got closer, something felt really off. He looked different somehow, and not just because he was dressed up. I sat down and we started with normal small talk, but within a few minutes I had this weird feeling that I knew him from somewhere else. Not just from hanging out with Sarah and Emma, but from somewhere before that. Then David smiled in this specific way, and it hit me like a truck. I knew that smile. I'd seen it before on someone else's face. My stomach dropped as I realized I was looking at Marcus's little brother. He looked different because he'd grown up a lot in 3 years, but it was definitely him. David must have seen the recognition on my face because his whole demeanor changed. The friendly, shy guy act disappeared, and he got this smug expression that reminded me exactly of his brother. I asked him directly if he was Marcus's brother, and he just laughed and said he'd been wondering when I'd figured out. The whole conversation that followed was honestly surreal. David explained that he'd been planning this for over 2 years, ever since I'd gotten his brother arrested. Apparently, David had somehow found out where I lived and had researched my social media to figure out where I liked to hang out. He'd deliberately joined the same volleyball league and positioned himself to meet Sarah and Emma. Over the course of more than a year, he'd slowly inserted himself into their friend group by being the perfect friend, always available to help with stuff, fun to be around, generous with buying drinks. He'd gained their trust completely. The whole time, he was subtly gathering information about me. My work schedule, my dating history, my insecurities, my family situation. He'd ask Sarah and Emma innocent-seeming questions about me, and they'd tell him everything, thinking he just had a harmless crush. David told me all of this like he was proud of it. Like he'd accomplished something impressive by manipulating my friends for 2 years just to get me alone for one conversation. I asked him what the point was. What was his endgame here? That's when he pulled out his phone and showed me that he'd been recording our entire conversation since I sat down. His plan was to get me to say something embarrassing or incriminating on tape, then send it to my workplace and post it online to humiliate me. He'd been hoping I'd admit to something that would make me look bad, or that he could manipulate the conversation to make me seem like a terrible person. David said he wanted to ruin my reputation the same way I'd ruined his brother's life. I was honestly shocked by how elaborate and insane this whole plan was. This guy had spent 2 years of his life, formed fake friendships, and orchestrated this entire setup just to try to get revenge on me for reporting his brother's credit card theft. I told David he was completely unhinged and got up to leave. But he wasn't done. He started talking louder, clearly trying to provoke me into saying something he could use. He brought up Marcus, claimed I'd lied about the credit card charges, said I was vindictive and manipulative. Other people in the restaurant were starting to stare, which I think was part of his plan. He wanted to create a scene where I'd look bad. But here's the thing, I had my own phone, and I'd started recording as soon as I realized who he was. I had everything. His confession about the 2-year manipulation plan, his admission that he'd been gathering information about me through my friends, his explanation of the revenge plot. I told David I'd recorded everything he just said, and his face went completely white. I left the restaurant and spent the rest of the weekend trying to figure out how to handle this situation. Update: 1 week later. I decided I had to tell Sarah and Emma what had happened. They deserved to know that someone they trusted had been manipulating them for over a year. I met with them and played the recording of David's confession. They were absolutely horrified. Apparently, David had been an even better manipulator than I'd realized. Over the past year and a half, he'd become genuinely close with both of them. He'd helped Sarah through a bad breakup, been there for Emma when her dad was in the hospital, been a consistent and supportive friend. They felt completely betrayed and used. Sarah started crying when she realized how many personal things she'd told David about me, thinking she was just sharing with a friend who cared about me. Emma was furious. She said she felt violated knowing that someone had been pretending to be her friend just to get information about someone else. Both of them immediately blocked David on everything and said they never wanted to see him again. But Sarah was especially upset because she realized David had been using her emotions to manipulate her. When she'd been going through her breakup, David had been extra supportive and had steered conversations toward talking about how important it was to have good friends who looked out for each other. He'd been making her feel guilty for not trying harder to set me up with him. Update: 2 weeks later. David apparently didn't take being cut off by Sarah and Emma very well. He started messaging them from different accounts, trying to convince them that I was lying about everything. He claimed the recording was fake, that I'd manipulated the conversation to make him look bad, that I was just trying to turn them against him because I was jealous of their friendship. When that didn't work, he tried a different approach. He started posting on social media about how he'd been betrayed by fake friends, and how some people will believe lies over someone they've known for years. Sarah showed me the posts, and it was clear he was trying to make himself look like the victim in this situation. But here's where David's plan really backfired on him. Sarah and Emma started talking to other people in their extended friend group about what had happened. Not to gossip, but because they were worried David might have been manipulating other people too. It turns out he had been. One of their friends, Jessica, said David had been asking her weird questions about her roommate for months. Another friend, Mike, realized David had been pumping him for information about his coworker, who David claimed to have a crush on. The more people they talked to, the more they realized David had this whole pattern of inserting himself into social groups and gathering information about specific people. Sarah ended up contacting the volleyball league to warn them about David's behavior. The league coordinator said they'd actually had complaints about David from other players who felt like he was asking too many personal questions and making people uncomfortable. Update: 1 month later. The situation with David escalated in a way I never expected. 2 weeks ago, I got a call from Marcus. Yes, the ex-boyfriend who started this whole mess 3 years ago. Marcus had found out about David's revenge plan and was absolutely furious with his brother. Apparently, David had been telling his family for years that he was going to get justice for what I'd done to Marcus, but they thought he just meant he was angry and would eventually get over it. Nobody realized David had been actively planning and executing this elaborate scheme. Marcus said his parents were horrified when they found out what David had been doing. They thought David had genuinely made friends with Sarah and Emma, and learning that he'd been manipulating them for over a year made them realize how unhinged his obsession with me had become. Marcus actually apologized to me for his brother's behavior. He said he understood why I'd pressed charges 3 years ago and that he'd been wrong to blame me for the consequences of his own actions. He also told me that David's behavior had been getting more concerning over the past few years. Apparently, David had been fired from 2 jobs for boundary issues with coworkers and had been asked to leave his college because of problems with stalking behavior toward other students. Marcus said his family was trying to get David into therapy, but David refused to admit he'd done anything wrong. Update: 6 weeks later. David's obsession with me apparently didn't end when his plan fell apart. Last week, I found out he'd been trying to contact my coworkers on LinkedIn, claiming he had important information about my character that they should know. Fortunately, my boss is pretty cool, and she called me immediately when David reached out to her. I explained the whole situation and played her the recording of David's confession. My company's HR department ended up sending David a cease and desist letter telling him to stop contacting employees or they'd pursue legal action for harassment. I also found out David had been leaving fake negative reviews for the restaurant where I work part-time, claiming I provided terrible service on dates he'd never actually been on. Sarah and Emma helped me gather evidence of all David's harassment, and I ended up filing a police report for stalking and harassment. The police said David's behavior definitely constituted criminal harassment, especially given the 2-year manipulation scheme and his continued attempts to damage my reputation after his plan failed. Update: 3 months later. David was charged with harassment and stalking. His lawyer tried to argue that everything he'd done was just awkward attempts at social interaction and that I was overreacting. But the evidence was pretty overwhelming. The recorded confession, the fake reviews, the attempts to contact my workplace, the manipulation of my friends, it all painted a clear picture of obsessive behavior. David ended up pleading guilty to harassment charges and got sentenced to a year of probation plus mandatory psychological evaluation and treatment. He's also required to stay away from me, my workplace, and anyone in my immediate friend group. Marcus actually testified against his own brother during the sentencing hearing. He told the court that David's obsession with me had become unhealthy and that David needed professional help to address his boundary issues. The judge said David's behavior showed a disturbing level of premeditation and manipulation, and that the 2-year scheme to infiltrate my social circle was particularly concerning evidence of stalking behavior. Update: 6 months later. Things have finally settled down, and my life is pretty much back to normal. Sarah and Emma and I are still close friends, though it took a while for them to get over feeling guilty about being manipulated. They kept apologizing for not seeing through David's act, but honestly, he was really good at what he was doing. We've all learned to be a little more cautious about new people who seem too interested in personal details or who ask a lot of specific questions about our other friends. David apparently moved back in with his parents after his sentencing and has been attending court-ordered therapy. Marcus said the family is hoping the professional help will address whatever underlying issues led to David's obsessive behavior. I haven't heard from David directly since the trial, and I hope it stays that way. The weirdest part of this whole experience was realizing how long someone had been watching and planning around my life without me having any idea. David knew my work schedule, my favorite restaurants, my friends' names, details about my family, all because he'd spent 2 years systematically gathering information. It made me much more aware of what I share on social media and how much personal information I give to people I don't know well. Final update: 1 year later. It's been a year since the blind date from hell, and I can honestly say this experience taught me a lot about trusting my instincts and setting boundaries. Sarah, Emma, and I are still great friends, and we've actually grown closer because of everything we went through together. We have this shared understanding now about how important it is to look out for each other. We also have a running joke about thoroughly vetting any future blind date setups. No more mystery men who ask too many questions about our personal lives. I heard through Marcus that David completed his court-ordered therapy and apparently made some progress in understanding why his behavior was problematic. Marcus said David finally admitted that his revenge plan was completely inappropriate and that he owes apologies to a lot of people. I don't know if David will ever actually apologize to me, and honestly, I don't need him to. I'm just glad he got the help he needed and that I don't have to worry about him showing up in my life again. The whole experience was terrifying while it was happening, but it also showed me how strong my friendships are and how capable I am of handling really difficult situations. Plus, I got a great story out of it, though I'm definitely sticking to dating apps for the foreseeable future. The moral of the story: if someone seems too interested in your personal life or asks oddly specific questions about your friends, trust your gut. And always record conversations with your ex's crazy relatives. Also, credit card fraud is a serious crime, and people who commit it shouldn't be surprised when there are legal consequences.